You can 3D print better miniatures. Let me show you how. I have 3D printed quite a few minis. I mean, I've actually printed about 1,500 minis alone just for my Etsy shop, varying from both small to big minis. So I have experienced just about any misprint you could at this point. When it comes to diagnosing a misprint and figuring out what steps I need to take to fix it, I like to utilize a miniature that I would print normally, or a type of miniature that I would print normally, as opposed to utilizing some type of test or calibration type of print, just because I know exactly the type of end result I want with the type of miniatures I utilize usually. And so I don't tend to usually like to use these test prints for these purposes. Instead, I like to use just normal prints that I would utilize in general. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. I'm going to focus on two main culprits when it comes to common misprints on your 3D printers for miniatures. Number one are support related issues. Number two is going to be related to bases. And then we'll talk a little bit about overall just detail enhancement as well. Supports hold the mini together during the printing process. They are an essential aspect of any successful printed miniature. However, not all supports are, great. Pre-supported miniatures, the quality of those kind of ebbs and flows, but they tend to be the culprit in a lot of our misprinted miniatures. So let's talk about a couple different ways that plays into it and how we fix that. So support related misprints usually manifest in one of two ways. Either you have only printed supports at the end of it, so the miniature has just completely fallen out of the supports, or part of the miniature has not printed properly because of a support related issue. You'll usually see these weird flat areas where the supports have failed to connect, and so the area of the miniature hasn't printed properly and just kind of turns into nonsensical goop. And it kind of ruins the miniature overall. Sometimes you can repurpose them, but overall it ends up being a wasted miniature, unfortunately. So there are three main levers we can utilize to fix support related misprints. So let's start with the first one. If there are too few supports, then the weight of the mini will pull away from the supports and end up misprinting. Either you'll lose the entire miniature, or whatever part of the miniature that doesn't have enough supports will fall off because of the weight of the miniature is too much for the amount of supports you have. So the simple way to alleviate this is to simply add more supports in that area that is weakest. Another key part in making sure that your supports are functioning properly is the support contact. A lot of times this can be helped with making the support contact depth greater. So this is the amount that the support actually penetrates into the miniature, as well as the size of the contact point between the support and the miniature. Both of these factor into the strength of the connection point between the support and the miniature and how well it's going to hold on during the printing process. However, when messing with this setting, be careful because you don't want to overdo it and make the support so hard to remove from the miniature that you end up just not being able to use the miniature at all. Or when you do remove the supports, there is such a noticeable divot or mark left over that it ruins kind of the detail and the design of the miniature. So as with most things I'm talking about today, you want to change all of these settings very incrementally. It takes a lot of trial and error to really dial in that setting, but once you do, it can be really beneficial and you don't usually have to mess with it a bunch more. All right, enough. So the last thing you can try regarding support issues is by upping your exposure time. The exposure time leads to more curing of the miniature, and in the interest of supports, if your exposure time is too low, then the connection between the support and the miniature isn't curing properly enough and not attaching to the miniature. So you can increase that exposure time to increase the strength of that connection between both the support and the miniature. However, this is probably one of the last things I would try regarding supports, as upping exposure can ruin the detail of the miniature. And so when you are adjusting the setting, I would do it in very small incremental values. I usually go up in half seconds when I'm trying to adjust my exposure levels when I'm having issues. Maybe supports aren't your problem at all. Maybe you can't even get the mini to stick to the build plate. Well, let's talk about that then. Now, the most common issue that arises when you have an issue with the base or bottom adhering to the build plate is that it doesn't stick fully or at all, and you end up with a pile of cured resin just sitting in your vat, and you have to clear out the whole thing and hope it doesn't ruin your vat, and so on and so forth. So in this case, we have a pretty simple solution we can try initially, and that is merely increasing the bottom exposure time. Now the same applies here as to the regular exposure time. We want to change this value in very small increments. I like to stick with the half-second rule, and we just have to adjust this marginally until we find a good level that is adhering to our build plates well. You want to be really careful with this, because if you increase the bottom exposure time too much, then the bases can stick like extremely hard to the build plates, and when you try to remove them, it can make it really difficult, and you can end up breaking the miniature and disregarding anything else we've tried before, because now you just have a broken miniature. Alternatively, they have these flexible build plates you can put onto your pre-existing build plate that you can then bend to kind of pop off miniatures, which can potentially help with this issue. I don't have a lot of experience with those, but it's definitely something I want to try out, and maybe that would be something that would work best for you. So let's talk about low detail or low quality miniatures next. We want our minis to come out looking crisp and nice and smooth, so that when we paint them or use them in our games, they look as good as possible. First thing first is exposure. Exposure time can greatly affect the detail and quality of your printed miniatures. Commonly, if your exposure time is too high, it can kind of almost overbake your miniatures and blow out all the details on it and make it look really, really crappy. Unfortunately, I don't have a perfect number for your exposure time. It is one of those things that you have to kind of play with and adjust with yourself. So many other factors can affect printed miniatures, and especially what your exposure time should be. The type of resin you're utilizing, the quality of your FEP film, the supports, everything like that goes into affecting what your exposure time should be. So utilize the steps I talked about earlier, utilize that half-second increment and adjust it up and down until you find that sweet spot in a detail that you're happy with and where all your supports and your bottoms function properly. So I've gone over a couple different common misprinting issues that you will most likely come up with in your printing journey. But you say, Wes, I'm still having issues. My prints still turn out like garbage. What's going on? I tried all this. None of it worked. Well, let's talk about one more thing that may affect your print quality and cause misprints. The FEP film or FEP film, whatever you want to call it, is a major factor in print quality and causing misprints. One of the major issues that can arise is a cloudy FEP film. This can affect the amount of UV light transferring from your 3D printer to the resin and can cause supports not to connect, it can cause details not to happen, it can cause layers to not happen. It can cause tons and tons of issues. So if you're noticing misprints starting to occur and you tried all those other things and it's not fixing them, I would definitely check the quality of your FEP film. If it is too cloudy, or maybe it has bumps, scratches, unlevelness, all those types of things can affect your misprints in all of your 3D printed miniatures. So you want to make sure that your FEP film is not too worn, too cloudy, and banged up too much, because you'll start having tons and tons of misprints. And when I notice I'm starting to have multiple miniatures misprint on the same printer, that's one of the first things I check is the FEP film. A lot of people tend to stress about the tightness or looseness of the FEP film. I don't tend to stress too much about this. I will just take the FEP film, place it over the bottom area of the vat, and then press the bracket on, and that level of tightness has pretty much always done me good. Some people like to use like a small bottle cap or washer or something like that to get the proper level, but I wouldn't stress too much about it. If the film is pretty tight and not too loose, but also not have any give at all, then you should be okay. Unfortunately, 3D printers are just pretty complicated and technical pieces of machinery for a consumer product, and it takes a lot of trial and error to get your specific printer in combinations with the type of FEP film and the type of resin you're utilizing to work and function at the best level that it can. You're going to have to experiment with things like your exposure, your Z-axis, the leveling of your build plate, the types of resin you utilize. All of those different factors can come into play and are affected by so many other factors, but remember there's only so many that really you can control and have the biggest effect, and so I would just focus on those, and those are mainly what we've talked about today. Now, I covered some pretty basic topics overall, but I find these to be the most common occurrences when you are 3D printing, and if you want the best quality miniatures you can, then you have to kind of go through these steps to adjust and make sure that your miniatures are coming out the best they can. Well, now that you've mastered your 3D printer and have beautiful, high quality 3D printed miniatures, you need to paint them, right? Well, why don't you check out this video and you can learn a pretty cool way to paint your miniatures for your next project. And of course, you might as well subscribe to the YouTube channel and like this video. Helps me out, really appreciate it. And if you like this 3D printing content, let me know. I can produce tons more because I am 3D printing a bajillion miniatures every day through my Etsy shop. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know. If you don't want to mess with any of this, then check out my Etsy shop. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to elevate your game night.